Hello everyone, I'm Justin, and this is every project in the DC Extended Universe ranked from worst to best. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. 5 years after the debut of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which had quickly climbed all the way to the top of the box office, DC Studios decided to start up a film universe based on their own superhero properties called the DC Extended Universe, beginning with 2013's Man of Steel. But although that film was mostly successful financially as well as critically, it didn't take long for the franchise to lose its footing due to some very poor decision making that went on to leave a decade-long impact. So, despite some high highs, the DCEU's lows ultimately proved to be too much, and so it was announced earlier this year that the franchise would be rebooted into just the DCU, scrapping basically every iteration of their most popular characters from the last decade in favor of a fresh start. So, with the DCEU having officially wrapped up with the release of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, we think now's a good time to take a look back at each of the franchise's 17 installments and rank them from worst to best. Of course, this video is just for fun, and it's okay if our rankings are completely different from yours. Number 17, Suicide Squad, released in 2016. Just 3 projects in, and unfortunately, the DCEU had already managed to produce one of the worst superhero films in history with 2016's Suicide Squad, which really looked to have all the makings of a great installment as it featured quite a few notable actors in starring roles, such as Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn, Will Smith as Deadshot, and Viola Davis as Amanda Waller, the latter of whom will thankfully be returning in the new DCU. The movie also featured the franchise's debut appearance of arguably DC's most popular supervillain, the Joker. But, for one reason or another, the film just wasn't able to put it all together. Just like any other film though, there were a few bright spots sprinkled throughout, such as the previously mentioned Margot Robbie and Viola Davis's performances, the portrayals of El Diablo and Captain Boomerang, and the character introductions seen at the start of the film. But the more important stuff, specifically the villain, Will Smith's performance as the film's leading man, the writing, the pacing, and the performance and utilization of Joker's character was just poorly done all around. Number 16, Justice League, released in 2017. On to the 5th DCEU project now, which was basically the nail in the coffin for the franchise just 4 years in, as it seemed too worried with catching up to the ever-expanding MCU rather than its own characters and direction. Despite originally setting up the universe with a darker tone in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which admittedly not everyone loved, Justice League did a complete 180 in how it chose to portray its already established characters, and to me, it was definitely not for the better, as the film was chock full of jokes and one-liners that just didn't hit. And, in addition to mishandling the characters we met in the previous 4 films, the film didn't do a good job of introducing or fleshing out the new characters, Aquaman, Cyborg, and the Flash, making me feel that it probably would have been more productive to introduce at least one of them prior to the Justice League's team-up. Again though, there were a few bright spots here, with the biggest of them being the fight scene between Superman and the Justice League immediately after Superman's return to life, although Bruce Wayne meeting the Flash was great as well. And of course, it was just nice seeing Ben Affleck as Batman and Henry Cavill as Superman once again, even if it wasn't the same versions of these characters that I had gotten used to. The main thing that separates this film from Suicide Squad though, is that it honestly wasn't boring, just dumb, and that made it a somewhat fun viewing experience. Number 15, Black Adam, released in 2022. While ahead of its release, Black Adam appeared to be a step towards setting the DCEU back on track, it ultimately proved to be the perfect encapsulation of everything the franchise had been doing wrong, with the only thing really worthwhile from the project being its mid-credits scene that saw the return of Henry Cavill as Superman, although this was quickly made irrelevant when he was almost immediately taken out of the role once again. The film itself though was mostly just a compilation of action scenes with very little focus on the actual story, which, outside of the decent backstory for the character, wasn't that interesting anyways, thanks to some pretty bad characters placed at the forefront of it. And I'd say I really only liked 3 characters in the whole film, with those 3 being Black Adam himself, Cyclone, and the clear highlight of the project, Dr. Fate, while Atom Smasher and Hawkman were also reasonably enjoyable, although only about half the time. These few characters and its solid action sequences couldn't at all save this installment from being an overall boring viewing though, made even more difficult to get through by the plethora of corny one-liners and dialogue. Number 14, Wonder Woman 1984, released in 2020. For the first 3/4 or so of Wonder Woman 1984, I was actually thoroughly enjoying it, and was prepared to place it around the 9 or 10 spots on our list. But that final fourth really stunk everything going up and dropped the film down to number 14. Let's start with why I was originally going to place this one a lot higher, which was in large part due to the fantastic performance of Pedro Pascal as Max Lord, who was one of the better villains, or at least for most of the film, in the entire DCEU. And I also thought that Gal Gadot put in another great showing as Wonder Woman. In addition, although the circumstances around his poorly fleshed out return were very strange, I was still happy to see Chris Pine return as Steve Trevor, and for him and Diana to spend some more time together, although I definitely didn't like how the guy whose life Steve had taken over wasn't at all considered by the two, and just somehow didn't matter. I also just didn't like really anything that happened in the final 25 minutes, as it was filled with stupidity and convoluted plot development, most notably with how Max was able to touch everyone on Earth through their TV screens, and also how Diana's able to use the lasso of truth to do the same thing. But it really is a shame the film decided to end in the direction it did, because in my opinion, it was actually shaping up to be a solid, above-average installment for the franchise. But its great action, performances, and first 2 hours were, unfortunately, completely soiled, and made the film one of the DCEU's worst. Number 13, Birds of Prey, released in 2020. Unfortunately, another Harley Quinn installment towards the bottom of our list, which is to no fault of Margot Robbie, who was once again great and got way more to work with in this one than in the first Suicide Squad. And really, Birds of Prey is far more entertaining than the character's last appearance, with a captivating style, fantastic action, and some impressive direction. But it's still not really among the best of what the franchise has to offer. I really did like what the film attempted to do though, and it did a great job of telling its story through Harley Quinn's narration and unique perspective, as well as pretty seamlessly introduced and brought together its 5 main heroines: Quinn, Black Canary, Huntress, Renee Montoya, and Cassandra Cain. But I feel that a lot of the dialogue and quips thrown in just made some scenes a bit difficult to enjoy. And also, for a film with such a flashy and upbeat style, it did drag quite a bit, especially in its final stretch when the team was taking on Roman Sionis' goons. And speaking of Sionis, I thought he was a very solid villain, although nothing groundbreaking, and was played well by Ewan McGregor, who brought a great blend of humor and menace to the role, especially in his incredibly uncomfortable nightclub scene ahead of the film's final act. So, all in all, I think Birds of Prey was a good outing for the DCEU, and worked fine as a secondary storyline. Number 12, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, released in 2023. Despite what I'd consider a very strong first 20 minutes or so, Shazam! Fury of the Gods slowly began to outstay its welcome as the film dragged on for about 30 minutes longer than it really should have, in my opinion. Since, if things had gotten cut down a bit, I probably would have ended up ranking it a bit higher, as I do enjoy seeing the Shazam family on my screen a majority of the time, even if they're blurting out jokes that don't often hit. But unfortunately, the film definitely dragged, making its worst attributes stand out even more, like the disconnect between Billy as Shazam, played by Zachary Levi, and regular Billy, played by Asher Angel. As while Angel played the character more relaxed and emotional, Levi played it with an awkward enthusiasm that just didn't really work for this sequel, and I really feel that it would have been beneficial for regular Billy to have been on screen much more often, like in the original Shazam. I don't feel that the struggles this film had with portraying its heroes really carried over to its villains though, as I actually thought the Daughters of Atlas were pretty solid, and not only had enjoyable showcases of their power, but also motivations that were reasonably intriguing. Still though, they ultimately weren't anything spectacular, and just helped the film, along with its entertaining cast, stay a few tiers above the DCEU's very worst. Number 11, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, released in 2023. On to the final DCEU installment now, which actually turned out to be much better than I expected. Although I did have some pretty low expectations for it, primarily due to DC's lack of promotion for the film's release. But Aquaman 2 was, in my opinion, just about as good as the first Aquaman film, which I'll talk more about in a moment, as it managed to do everything the first film did just as well, while focusing on a new story between the two brothers, Arthur and Orm, the latter of whom was easily my favorite part of the 2 installments, thanks in large part to Patrick Wilson's performance. Along with the film's solid main characters and story, as well as some pretty great fight sequences, was a surprisingly solid villain in the form of Black Manta, who I personally didn't like much at all in the previous film, but was actually quite good here, which could be attributed to an improved performance from Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. The sequel not only managed to replicate the positives from the first film though, as the negatives could still be seen here, like the corny dialogue and its pacing, as Lost Kingdom really dragged in the middle. But I'd have to say the thing that bothered me the most was the strange utilization of Mera, as it kind of felt like she would only be thrown on screen whenever it was convenient for the story. It really wasn't too jarring though, nor did it do much to hamper the overall film, which I think was a worthy sequel to the 2018 installment. Number 10, Aquaman, released in 2018. Moving right on to the first Aquaman, which also happens to be the DCEU's peak financial success. And although it didn't quite reach that level in terms of quality, I'd still consider it to be a worthwhile installment in the franchise. Just as we discussed for the film's sequel, Aquaman was filled with plenty of bad jokes and corny dialogue that made it difficult to get through at times, especially when Arthur and Mara were alone on screen together. But there were also some pretty actually cool moments and characters, specifically the multiple well-put-together action sequences throughout the film, and the movie's villain, Marius, aka Ocean Master, who, although great in the sequel as well, was really fantastic in this one, and did a great job of catching my interest whenever it may have wandered elsewhere. He wasn't the only good performance in the film though, as really everyone did a solid job, and helped make the movie a pretty fun watch despite having to get through some ugly dialogue. Number 9, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, released in 2016. While Batman v Superman wasn't quite as bad as the likes of 2016's Suicide Squad and 2017's Justice League, it, like said films, did unfortunately play a pretty big part in why the DCEU was eventually brought to an end, due to it inarguably failing to capitalize on its intriguing premise centered around the franchise's two main heroes. Despite the story between the two failing to captivate as much as it should have though, the actors portraying them, Ben Affleck and Henry Cavill, still put in some great performances, and proved to be as close to perfect castings for their respective characters as you could find. The same can't be said about Jesse Eisenberg's casting as Lex Luthor, however, which, although reasonably enjoyable on its own, was again just not the right decision or direction for the franchise to go in. The film also saw the introduction of Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman, whose DCEU debut, I felt, was actually pretty well done, and I enjoyed the interactions we got to see between her and Bruce Wayne, as well as the teases to her past sprinkled throughout. Another enjoyable aspect of the film was definitely its action sequences, and more specifically, the fight sequence between Batman and Superman, which was actually very well constructed in my opinion, up until the laughable Martha scene towards the end. But still, while moments like this were notably pretty bad, I found the overall film to be a fun, albeit somewhat drawn out watch. Number 8, Man of Steel, released in 2013. I've seen Man of Steel placed all over other DCEU rankings, with some having the film towards the top and others having it towards the bottom. But we think that right around the middle is probably the best spot for it, with it leaning closer towards the positive side of the list rather than the negative. This is in large part due to the performances of the film's talented cast, and most notably Henry Cavill, who despite having only one solo outing as the hero, managed to resonate enough with audiences to the point that a large portion of fans still view him as their favorite Superman. Meanwhile, opposite of Supes in this one was General Zod, played by Michael Shannon, whose performance really helped carry the supervillain towards the top of our personal DCEU villain rankings. However, while I enjoyed most of the two's time on screen, I definitely did not enjoy most of their drawn-out fight sequence at the end, that caused an incredibly unnecessary amount of damage and made Superman look completely careless, along with a few other moments where it felt the film's pacing was lacking. But despite that, I really enjoyed it overall, and do plan on going back to watch it all again. Number 7, Blue Beetle, released in 2023. The second to last installment of the DCEU, Blue Beetle can also possibly be considered as part of the new DCU starting up next year, since the co-CEO of DC Studios, James Gunn, has confirmed that the actor portraying Blue Beetle in this film, Xolo Maridueña, will remain in the role for future projects, which I'm very happy to hear, since he was perfect in his debut appearance. And I really do hope everything about this film actually remains canon for DC's new cinematic universe, because I just don't see any reason to replace any of the film's great cast, or anything Jaime Reyes and his family went through in this one, as the film not only featured an action-packed and fun origin story for the character, but also one of the franchise's most emotional stories involving his family, each of whom were given time to stand out and form a relationship with the audience. The humor, like most of the franchise, wasn't always great, specifically all the George Lopez shrieking, but there were still a bunch of genuinely funny moments that became more and more common as the movie wore on and got better and better, including all the well-delivered quips thrown in during the film's great action sequences that perfectly paired the characters' abilities with some incredible choreography and visual effects that generated a response for me every single time. I'm really looking forward to whenever Jaime makes his return to the big or small screen after this one, and I really hope things pick up where the film's ending and mid-credits scene left off. Number 6, Wonder Woman, released in 2017. Up until 2017, there were only about 6 woman-led solo superhero films released across 30 plus years, since studios were, for some reason, convinced that these types of projects could never resonate with fans on the same level as those centered around male superheroes. Well, Wonder Woman's release swiftly disproved that notion, with it not only making a ton of money at the box office, but also just being a great movie, which it seemed DC particularly had some difficulty with creating during their franchise's first 4 years. Among the things that worked in this film was Gal Gadot's performance as the film's titular character, which was very charming and enjoyable, as well as her chemistry with co-star Chris Pine, whose character, Steve Trevor, actually turned out to be my favorite non-super character in the entire franchise, while the two's love story was also easily the franchise's best, and one of my favorite superhero love stories in general. In addition, this installment managed to be one of the unfortunately few genuinely and consistently funny ones in the DCEU, while still featuring some emotional beats that really drew me in, along with some great action as well, most notably the sequence in No Man's Land. So, thanks to all that, as well as it easily being the franchise's most impactful installment, Wonder Woman for now lands at number 6 on our list, but matches up very closely with our next 3 spots. Number 5, Shazam, released in 2019. Moving on to another very funny installment, and probably the 3rd funniest project in the franchise with Shazam, which I feel really deserves way more attention and praise than it's gotten over the years, even if it doesn't really matter or connect to anything else DC had going on at the time, which I actually feel was to its benefit in terms of quality, as it was able to focus solely on its own story and characters, rather than trying to fit itself in with the rest of DC's League of Heroes. Also helping the film's quality was its great cast, and more specifically, the film's 3 main actors, including the previously mentioned Zachary Levi and Asher Angel, along with Jack Dylan Grazer, who is also one of the best parts of the film's sequel. And while earlier I complained about the lack of connection between Levi's Shazam and Angel's Billy Batson in Fury of the Gods, in the original Shazam film, the two's performances were just about perfectly aligned, and there really weren't any moments in this one where I felt taken out of the story as a result of that, which I'd say was probably due to better writing and story construction here as well. In addition to all the great comedy and performances, was an intriguing and relatable origin story for the character that featured some great sequences of Billy learning how to use his powers, a very solid supervillain in Mark Strong's Dr. Sivana, and a great emotional story surrounding Billy's quest to find his mother and his eventual acceptance of his found family that eventually turns into the Shazam family. Again, this installment, Wonder Woman, and the next spot on our list are very close, so I could see our rankings for this one changing over time, but for now, we'll place it here at number 5. Number 4, The Flash, released in 2023. As an ending for the original DCEU, I personally think that The Flash was actually a pretty great and impressive finale, especially when considering how much was going on behind the scenes and all the uncertainty surrounding the franchise at the time of its production. And it serves well as a goodbye to a few of the franchise's main characters, particularly, of course, The Flash, Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman, and Ben Affleck's Batman, the latter of whom, in his short time on screen, once again proved that he wasn't at all the problem with the DCEU's version of the character, and that, with good writing, he could have been viewed as a much better Batman portrayal than he currently is. Other good performances were seen through the film's 2 other main characters, Michael Keaton's Batman and Sasha Calle's Supergirl, with the former making his return to the big screen for the first time in over 30 years, and the latter excelling as the first live-action Supergirl in a feature film in almost 40 years. And their inclusions, paired with the return of Michael Shannon's Zod, I think actually helped the film's story when looking at it as a wrap-up of the franchise and the Flash's character. Not every cameo worked for me though, specifically those shown during the Colliding of Worlds scene, but I also don't feel that they necessarily hurt the film either. Just probably should have been replaced with characters who could have actually appeared and not just be recreated with CGI. Speaking of the movie CGI, it was on the whole pretty awful, and I don't usually like to complain about poor CGI, hence why I haven't yet mentioned any other instances of it in the franchise up to this point. But there's really just no getting past the Flash's objectively bad visual effects. Still though, that didn't take as much away from my viewing experience as it did for other viewers, and I thoroughly enjoyed Barry's journey through time to try and save his mother, which showcased both an entertaining origin story through his younger self and an emotional arc for him in the present. Number 3, Zack Snyder's Justice League, released in 2021. In our number 3 spot, we have the technically not canon Snyder Cut of the 2017 Justice League film, that, despite doubling the length of the original from 2 hours to 4 hours, managed to be far more captivating, and for the most part, the extended runtime proved beneficial to the franchise's main cast of characters that weren't properly fleshed out during the DCEU's first 4 years of existence, such as The Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman. with Cyborg in particular really shining and nearly being my favorite character of the film. There were still definitely a few overly long scenes, and just flat out unnecessary ones of course, since the movie's 4 whole hours long. But the film was formatted well enough that it didn't feel like much of a drag, although I'd probably choose to watch each of its 7 chapters as if they were episodes for a miniseries on a rewatch. Along with the expansion on the 3 previously mentioned characters, there were many other changes made from the original cut that played a part in why we've decided to rank this version 13 spots higher, such as a noticeable decrease in corny jokes and dialogue, and in turn an increase in consistency for how this universe's characters were portrayed. With this film being, in my opinion, the best appearance for each Justice League member of the entire franchise, outside of Wonder Woman, who was probably better in her solo film, but was still great here. Particularly, I thoroughly enjoyed how Batman and Superman were presented, and although these iterations didn't resemble their comic book counterparts as closely as they maybe should have, I really didn't mind the direction Snyder had for them, especially since all the bumps in the road throughout Man of Steel and Batman v Superman resulted in this incredible climax to that trilogy. The Snyder Cut also featured an immensely improved version of Steppenwolf, whose motivations here made him far more interesting and enjoyable, along with another even more powerful villain looming over the story in Darkseid, whose brief time on screen, combined with Superman's darker turn towards the end of the film and the great nightmare scene in the epilogue, set up a very compelling next chapter that will, unfortunately, likely never come to pass. At least we were able to see the direction the DCEU was originally supposed to go in with this one though, and are now left with an idea of where it could have gone next. Number 2, Peacemaker's Season 1, released in 2022. Although I did grow up a wrestling fan, and John Cena is one of my favorites of all time, my bias towards him is only about 10% of why I've chosen to place Peacemaker's first season this high in our rankings, with the other 90% being because each of its 8 episodes are genuinely fantastic, chock full of interesting and entertaining characters, hilarious jokes, and great performances, with my favorite among them being John Cena as Peacemaker, while Freddie Stroma's Vigilante comes in at an extremely close second. Murn, Harcourt, Economos, and Adebayo were also all great, and each of the 6 main cast members had perfect chemistry with one another, resulting in a close to familial relationship between the 6, not unlike what the show's director and now co-CEO of DC Studios James Gunn did with the MCU's Guardians of the Galaxy. And speaking of familial relationships, Christopher Smith's backstory involving the murder of his brother Keith and their father Augie, later revealed to be a supervillain known as the White Dragon, was dark and unique when compared to almost every other superhero property out there. And it, combined with the various times we were shown Chris wasn't actually as bad as we thought he was when we first met him, as well as John Cena's charming performance, resulted in Peacemaker becoming one of the most likable characters of the franchise. I was also intrigued by the show's main villains, the Butterflies, whose motivations were built up nicely and aligned perfectly with Peacemaker's ultimate transformation from villain to hero in the season finale, which also featured a great joke following the Butterflies' defeat that tied the series in with the rest of the DCEU, although I feel that Gunn might regret putting that in if he plans on bringing the series into the DCU, since John Cena's Peacemaker has already been confirmed to return. And number 1, The Suicide Squad, released in 2021. With both of our top 2 DCEU projects having been created by James Gunn, as well as 3 of our top 15 MCU projects, I feel it's safe for us to assume that he, along with co-CEO Peter Safran, will create something special with the DCU, as he'd already managed to greatly improve on one of DC's weakest installments with The Suicide Squad, which isn't just among my favorite DCEU or DC movies ever, but is one of my favorite superhero projects in general, with an intriguing style, hilarious and charismatic characters, well-crafted action sequences, and a gripping story with multiple twists and turns throughout, with my favorite among them being Peacemaker's heel turn that led to the murder of Rick Flag. I also really enjoyed and had a good laugh at the film's opening sequence that saw a team that it appeared could be the movie's main Suicide Squad all dying brutal deaths, outside of Flag and Harley Quinn of course, who were both much better here than in the original, with Margot Robbie really proving herself as the perfect casting choice for the character, as did the rest of the main cast for their respective characters, including John Cena's Peacemaker, Idris Elba's Bloodsport, David Dastmalchian's Polka Dot Man, Daniela Melchior's Ratcatcher, and Sylvester Stallone's King Shark. As I mentioned before, another thing that makes this film so great is Gunn's direction, which enhanced both the action sequences and the movie's emotional beats, with some examples being the previously mentioned Team 1 and Flag death scenes, the beautiful Harley Quinn fight sequence, the squad's defeat of Starro the Conqueror, and most notably for me, the shootout in the film's final act between Peacemaker and Bloodsport that nearly resulted in Peacemaker's death. I'd almost lost all hope in the franchise prior to the Suicide Squad's release, to the point that I almost chose against watching it. But I'm very glad I did, as there aren't too many superhero films that I rank above it. And those were our rankings of every single DCEU project. For any of you curious as to how Chris and I would individually rank the franchise, I'll be placing a graphic on the screen of our rankings in tier list form. And you should also leave your own lists in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to see our other DC content, click the second link in the description for our DC playlist. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.